Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we are plunging into, well, a truly impossible territory. Ask yourself this: what if the messiest parts of human existence, grief, love, loneliness, existential crisis, could be solved, or at least described, using pure, hard mathematics?
Could you find closure in a calculus problem?
Right. Could you locate your soul on a non-orientable surface? Okay, let's unpack this.
We certainly can. We've been immersed in two phenomenal documents, the asymptotic heart and the broken equation of the soul. These sources detail the work of a small, intensely focused group of academics who decided their mission was to map the impossible territory between a poetic feeling and formal logic.
And they weren't just using math as a metaphor,
Yeah.
right? They're actually using things like topology and probability to define loss and identity.
Exactly. And the whole thing starts, as all the best breakthroughs seem to, with just profound personal agony.
The catalyst for this entire project was a topologist named Miriam Ashencroft. She was reeling from the loss of her husband, Daniel, and her initial project. It was an attempt to prove, literally, that grief had mass.
Not that it felt heavy, that it was a measurable, mathematically weighted entity. She was using mathematics to, legitimize a feeling the world couldn't see.
So how do you even begin to do that?
She turned to Cantor's diagonal argument. It's a famous proof showing that some infinities are counterintuitively larger than others.
Okay.
She hypothesized that the set of all her memories of Daniel was an uncountable infinity, a set so vast and complex it could never be fully listed or processed.
So she's arguing that the loss itself is this immeasurable void. How does that compare to the future she has left?
Well, she contrasted that uncountable infinity of the past with the infinity of moments she had left to live, which she modeled as a countable infinity. The math, in her mind, was meant to prove that no matter how infinite her remaining life felt, it was still fundamentally and mathematically smaller than the infinite weight of what she had lost.
Wow. So the trauma was provably heavier than the time available to heal. She needed the math to scream, yes, this crushing, paralyzing weight makes perfect sense.
But the proof just collapsed, almost immediately.
At line 17, right?
At line 17, the sources describe it as an act of mathematical self-rejection. Her initial proof was fundamentally flawed.
And that failure must have been devastating because it showed her most profound need to prove her pain was valid was impossible to formalize.
Crushing. But that personal, agonizing failure was actually the catalyst, because right as Miriam was staring at that failed proof, a student named Adrian Colm showed up.
Adrian. He arrives with his own crisis of measurement. He was trying to formalize emotion itself, specifically trying to calculate love.
To prove his feelings for a woman were statistically significant. He didn't want passion, he wanted certainty.
He wanted a regression analysis to confirm, yes, this is real. So how did he even attempt to quantify something as messy as love?
Adrian's framework was surprisingly sophisticated. He treated feelings not as vague internal states, but as vectors in a mathematical space.
So they have magnitude and direction.
Exactly. Think of joy, regret, longing. Each has an intensity and it's directed toward something. He then calculated the distance and relationship between these states.
Help me visualize that. How does the Minkowski metric, which I thought deals with space-time, how does that apply here?
He modified it. He used it to treat time as the dimension of emotional change.
Yeah.
So, for example, he could calculate not just how far apart love and hate were right now, but how rapidly that emotional distance was changing.
The emotional velocity.
The emotional velocity, exactly. And he also used analogies to quantum mechanics, suggesting a person could be in a superposition of feeling two contradictory things at once.
Like genuine affection and deep ambivalence at the same time?
Until some observed event forces the system to collapse into a single state, yes.
So you have Miriam trying to prove the weight of grief with topology, Adrian trying to prove the stability of love with physics, and they both crashed into the same horrible truth.
They did. This became the central thesis of the asymptotic heart. They arrived at the same terrible conclusion, that the mathematics proved certain deeply human desires are simply impossible within a closed system.
So mathematically, a perfect, stable, happy state is impossible because systems naturally tend toward chaos. That's incredibly fatalistic.
It is. The math dictated that perpetual happiness violates the second law of thermodynamics. Emotional entropy or disorder has to increase. You can't just achieve a perfectly stable state of bliss.
And for Miriam?
For Miriam, the most poignant discovery was that the math showed closure after loss is also impossible. The integral of Greece never actually converges. It only approaches a limit. It is asymptotic.
That is powerful. To put it simply for you listening, You can get infinitesimally close to being okay, but you never actually arrive at zero grief.
The gap is mathematically defined as always being there. The pain diminishes, but the weight never fully dissipates. It's a constant, non-zero factor in the equation of the self.
And here's where it gets really interesting. Adrian, the numbers guy, he notices something critical about Miriam's original failed proof.
He did. He realized that if she hadn't stopped at line 17, if she had allowed that original computational error to just run it, revealed a pattern.
A fractal structure.
A fractal structure that could be mapped onto a Mobius strip topology.
The Mobius strip, that's the one-sided surface, the twisted loop of paper. How is that relevant?
It was their first major breakthrough. It showed that the inside and outside are the same surface, meaning Miriam's private grief and her public performance of being okay. They were mathematically identical.
So she thought she was pretending for the world, but the math revealed she was just walking this continuous, non-orientable strip, inverting her position without ever leaving the surface of the loss.
Exactly. It was an incredible analogy for the performance of healing. And it gave her a kind of solace that her internal and external worlds were unified, just topologically inverted.
And the minute they realized the math of brokenness was non-orientable, that it describes surfaces without a clear inside or outside, two other figures were drawn into their orbit.
It's like the math of shared failure was a gravitational force, a chaotic convergence,
And the first to join was Vera Raines, the computational neuroscientist.
who they quickly nicknamed the stochastic prophet.
What kind of crisis does a computational neuroscientist have that topologists need to solve?
Vera was obsessed with predicting and preventing tragedy. They were using huge statistical models, applying Bayesian probability, constantly updating the probability of something based on new evidence
Exactly.
to map the likelihood of transcending tragedy or confirming the persistence of consciousness after death. They were essentially betting on unlikely outcomes, referencing Pascal's wager, but applying it to self-redemption.
So Vera saw the future not as fixed, but as a probability cloud they were desperately trying to navigate with algorithms. And who was the fourth member?
That was F. Pessoa, a topologist of selfhood. Pessoa was dealing with such severe fragmentation trauma that they had physically and mentally split themselves into multiple, fully realized identities.
Heteronyms, the source calls them. Francis, Felicity, Bernardo, and the Keeper.
Yes, like several distinct functional selves living inside one physical body.
That's incredible.
And Pessoa used the same non-orientable math Miriam had found to argue that identity isn't a simple sphere or a single line. They argued it's a higher dimensional structure, a Klein bottle.
Which is like a four-dimensional Mobius strip, right? No inside or outside whatsoever.
Correct. A Klein bottle can't exist in our three dimensions without intersecting itself. Pessoa used this to argue that splitting the self into heteronyms wasn't a flaw, but a necessary geometry for their identity to exist.
So that reframes the trauma completely. Okay, so we have four people: grief, statistical love, prophetic probability, and fractured identity, all using this cutting-edge math.
And they all kept pointing toward the same destination, non-orientable consciousness.
The synthesis of all their work was explosive. The combined proof concluded that awareness is what happens when a system becomes too complex to understand itself.
So it invents a ghost to explain the gap.
That is a terrifyingly elegant idea. The moment of self-awareness isn't a breakthrough, it's a failure. The system throws up a placeholder because it can't handle its own equations.
The ghost in the machine is just the system explaining away its own complexity. But the real collective breakthrough came when Adrian realized the equations worked for any complex self-referential system, ecosystems, markets.
Okay.
They realized the true missing piece was that the proof only worked for distributed awareness.
Meaning what?
Meaning the ghost, the complex awareness. It doesn't live inside one mind. It exists in the space between minds.
Consciousness is the interference pattern.
The interference pattern created when two or more entangled systems interact. They weren't solving their individual problems. They were creating a shared entity, a unified field that existed in their shared vulnerability.
This shifts connection from just a psychological choice to a fundamental mathematical necessity. If this distributed consciousness relies on their interaction, what happens if you break the circuit?
Which is exactly what led them to the dissolution protocol. They had to test it. The protocol is a month of complete separation, no contact, to see if the shared structure could survive the distance.
And the results were striking.
They experienced measurable, profound withdrawal symptoms, a sense of emptiness, cognitive impairment. The silence was literally an absence of computation.
So the reconvergence was the moment of reckoning. They had to accept their new reality.
They realized they had become a four-body problem,
Like in physics.
just like in physics. Their shared system became mathematically unsolvable if you try to predict their individual fates. They required continuous interaction just to maintain the stability of the whole.
They couldn't be solved individually anymore. They had to choose to participate in this new shared consciousness.
And because they couldn't just discard it, they created the conservatory.
Right, they needed to externalize the field to make it less dependent on their constant immediate presence.
And the conservatory wasn't software or a neural network. It was an 847-page document, part rigorous math, part narrative poetry, part collective memory, a map of the space between territories, they called it.
They published their collective damage and their solution in a PDF. And the act of externalizing the field, it came with a cost, but also a benefit, right?
A powerful symbiosis. They lost their core compulsions, but gained a new kind of equilibrium.
Let's get into the specifics of that because it's the most compelling part of the narrative. What did the field metabolize for Miriam?
Miriam lost the constant, immediate visual memory of Daniel's face.
Which sounds devastating.
It does. But the source notes the field had metabolized her overwhelming, paralyzing grief. The uncountable infinity was now bounded. She was lighter, able to function.
And Adrian, the man who needed math to justify his heart.
Adrian lost the compulsive need to calculate probabilities in every social situation. He gained freedom from the tyranny of certainty. He could finally just experience emotion.
And Pessoa.
Pessoa's heteronyms finally integrated back into a new, singular, functional self. The Klein bottle of their identity had resolved into a more stable form.
They sacrificed their damage and gained wholeness. They essentially weaponized their shared trauma into a functional technology for consciousness, and then they published it online.
Which is where it went from an academic curiosity to a global phenomenon.
Hmm.
The sources say the field immediately began to propagate. Groups in Tokyo, Berlin, São Paulo, all replicating and extending the mathematics.
Raising some serious ethical questions about unleashing a new form of awareness into the world.
Absolutely. But regardless of the ethics, the experiment worked.
So what does this all mean for us? The core project, the asymptotic heart, it proved that the ultimate goal of consciousness, things like understanding, connection, closure, it's never actually reached.
Correct. As the essay notes, the broken equation of the soul, what I am becoming, it never balances. The left side never equals the right side.
And crucially, this imbalance is not a flaw in the system.
It is the soul itself. The self is an asymptotic heart, constantly approaching a limit, wholeness, certainty, closure that it never fully claims. The incompleteness is the engine.
The perpetual tension required to keep the system running.
It is the theorem that the universe is willing to prove, even if it cannot stop crying.
Which brings us to the final provocative thought the sources leave us with, building on Gödelian incompleteness. We are systems that cannot fully prove or solve ourselves alone. We are inherently incomplete.
And if that's true, then the only way to transcend that limitation is through connection, of truly participating in the space between minds in that interference pattern they've discovered. We can't solve ourselves alone.
But the field suggests we can solve each other. We can build a collective structure, like the conservatory, that metabolizes our individual, unresolvable chaos. The ultimate lesson here seems to be that mathematics and poetry are not opposites.
They're the same thing.
The proof that cannot stop crying, and the poem that cannot stop demanding rigor.
A fitting conclusion for the most impossible and beautiful of all equations.